Hi, everyone. In this episode, we delve into chilling accounts of creatures so bizarre and elusive that they will challenge your understanding of the natural world. Bundle up as we hear the chilling details, examine the evidence, and attempt to unravel the truth behind these enigmatic creatures. So, if you're in it to win it, please squash that subscribe button and let's get into the stories. I spent just under 20 years working as a police officer in northern Minnesota. I could tell you quite a few wild stories, but there's only one that ever chilled me to the bone. It was a cold January night when I got a call about a deceased elk lying dead in the road. Dealing with roadkill is definitely not my favorite part of the job, but it was a vehicle hazard and had to be dealt with. Car accidents up here in the winter can spell death even if you manage to walk away uninjured. Oftentimes, we have cold enough weather and bad enough cell reception to make it dangerous to be stranded on the side of the road for more than a few hours. I really wanted to get home early that night, but I had to go deal with this elk carcass first. At the bare minimum, I had to clear it off the roadway. I grabbed the truck and a tow chain and headed to the scene. It was snowing hard by the time I got there, but I immediately noticed the antlers sticking out of the snow-covered lump in the road. The creature was huge. It took up the entire lane. It was going to be a bitch to move. I was going to have to tow it as close to the shoulder as possible, and then see if I could roll it down the ditch for the scavengers to take care of. No way was I going to be able to get this thing into the back of the pickup. I parked the truck and was nearly knocked on my ass by the stench of decomp as soon as I exited the vehicle. It was the worst I had ever smelled, and I had been on more than a few wellness checks that resulted in dead bodies, often days after they had passed. And this was 100 times worse. I should have known at that point there was something terribly wrong. It was cold enough out here that the temperature should have halted any decomposition. Anything that died here would have essentially been in a freezer. There shouldn't have been a smell at all. Strike one. I approached the carcass with my hand over my mouth. I had to bury my face in my coat to even get close enough to get a chain around the creature's back legs. As I was attaching the chain, I realized that the elk wasn't simply covered in snow. Its fur was pure white. No wonder this thing got hit on the road. The driver probably didn't even see it. That's when I realized there was no driver. The call that had come in didn't hit the elk. They just saw it in the road. And there was no way that a vehicle hit an animal this size and drove away. They would have needed to call a tow truck and possibly an ambulance. But we hadn't received a call for either. And this is a small town. The station would have been notified if an ambulance would have been sent out. But there was nothing. Strike two. Regardless of my unfounded suspicions, I attached the carcass to my truck and got ready to drag it out of the road. Before I did, I went over to take a look at its head. I had never seen an albino elk before, and I was curious. The animal was thin and in poor shape, under-muscled and bony. I grabbed one of the antlers and lifted its head up. It took a moment to realize what I was looking at, since the creature's white fur seemed to blend seamlessly with the exposed bone. It had no skin on its face. None at all. Its head was just a bare skull. Its eyes and nose were gone. There was no blood around its face or neck, indicating any scavengers had got to it. In fact, there were no wounds on this animal at all. Nothing to indicate it had even been in a vehicle collision. I was definitely disturbed by this thing, but I just wanted to get it moved out of the road so I could go home. Strike three. I got in the truck and started dragging the carcass forward, inching it to the side of the road when I felt some resistance behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The elk was kicking and thrashing around, trying to free itself from the chains. It was alive. I stopped the truck and got out with my gun drawn. There was no way this thing was alive smelling like that, and without any skin on its face. It got loose in less than 20 seconds and stood up in the center of the road. I had my sidearm aimed at center mass, but I was afraid I wouldn't be able to take it down. I had heard stories of wendigos, and I knew that was what was standing in front of me. I jumped back into the truck and locked the door. The creature knew the game was up. I think it was lying there in the road pretending to be dead so it could ambush someone. Like I said, I've heard about Wendigos, but I'm still not sure what they do with people when they get them. I can't imagine it is anything good, and to be honest, I'm surprised I didn't find out that day. It let me get close enough to ensnare its hind legs with a chain. Looking back, I don't know how I'm not dead. The monster watched me inside the safety of my truck and walked in front of it, almost daring me to hit it. I don't imagine it would have killed it if I had. It stayed there for another minute or so. I'm not sure how long it was. The minutes felt like years, and then it disappeared into the snowy woods, like it had never even existed in the first place. I've always been open to the strange and paranormal, but recently I had an experience that was so bizarre, there's no doubt in my mind that it was real. I live in Big Rapids, Michigan. I have this friend, Steve, who loves to scour the internet for supernatural and conspiracy stuff. One day, he came to my house all excited about something he found on Reddit. To me, that was already a red flag. He said there's been chatter about a supposedly abandoned underground military bunker in the Huron-Manistee National Forests. I'd never heard of anything like that and just laughed at him, but he tried to talk me into checking it out. I was skeptical, but he showed me the Reddit thread, which even had pictures from the alleged site. Someone posted coordinates and landmarks in case anyone wanted to look for it. Here's the thing. There were also sightings of a strange creature in the area, and people speculated that it was connected to the hidden bunker. I know your listeners are familiar with the Dog Man. There are tons of stories on your channel about encounters all over the country. Michigan is actually known for its Dog Man sightings, even in my hometown of Big Rapids. I've heard about it from some of the old-timers, but never seen him myself. The creature that people described sounded a lot like the Dog Man, basically a werewolf-type creature. Steve didn't want to go alone, and I finally gave in, as long as he agreed to treat me to an 8-corner all-meaty from Jet's Pizza. The Huron-Manistee National Forests cover nearly 100,000 acres. Steve followed a map and the coordinates and took us up a trail, but then we took a narrower trail that went deep into the woods. I had no idea where we were and began to worry. As we hiked, we heard rustling sounds nearby. I was a little concerned because there's bobcats and bears in the forest, and I'm pretty sure we weren't on any kind of official trail. I swore I smelled something too, like rotting meat and sulfur. It didn't bother Steve, so I kept my mouth shut. Then we heard something else. I don't know exactly what it was, but it sounded like a hyena, which would be crazy. It was fairly close too. I said we should head back and that this was just a wild goose chase, but Steve insisted we were close and even pointed to a large white pine with carvings in the trunk he was sure the Redditors mentioned. We finally came upon a small hill that housed a concrete door buried under a bunch of foliage. I couldn't believe it, and Steve had no qualms about rubbing it in my face. Still, I was worried about whatever animal made those weird sounds. Steve was only focused on one thing as he pulled open the door and went inside. I reluctantly followed. We used the flashlights on our phones to look around. It was mostly empty except for some old beer cans. From the outside, you wouldn't be able to tell how big the place was, but as we went further, I realized it was a sprawling complex. There were several rooms, some with old, dusty tables, cabinets, and gurneys. It looked like a medical or research facility. It's clear it hadn't been used in decades, and I couldn't understand how this place stayed a secret all these years. Steve said the Redditors thought the military did some kind of secret experiments during World War II. I would have laughed before, but at that point, I thought anything was possible. He was intent on finding something that would prove those theories, but outside of some old, rusted equipment, there was nothing. I was hesitant to go further as the place proved to be quite labyrinthine. Steve made fun of me, but then we heard noises somewhere up ahead. It was the sound of clattering metal, like someone was knocking things over. I grabbed Steve and tried to head back, but he shook me loose and called out to whoever it was, taunting them. I thought he was nuts. Then we heard it, that hyena sound echoing in the concrete maze. It grew louder, and for the first time that day, Steve gave pause. That's when we saw it. At the end of a long corridor, a massive figure emerged. The flashlight wasn't strong enough to get a good look, but it was definitely an animal prowling on all fours. It was huge, with stringy, black fur and a wolf-like face. Steve took a picture, and when it flashed, a hyena laugh erupted from its throat as it stood up on its hind legs. That's when we saw its upper body was actually human, like with arms that put Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson to shame. This thing was huge, maybe 7 feet tall. Steve screamed, and we both turned and ran. We heard the creature galloping behind us, closer and closer. We finally made it to the entrance, slammed the door shut, and kept going down the narrow trail. As we ran, we heard that hyena sound again, and something in the bushes behind us. Who knows if it was the same creature from the bunker or another one. We finally made it to the main trail, but we kept going until we got to the car. Nothing followed us. We stood in silence for several minutes as we caught our breath. I had a hard time processing what had just happened, but Steve burst into a wide grin. He was excited about what we saw and that he had proof to prove those conspiracies. Then the color drained from his face as he searched for his phone with all the pictures. It was gone. He probably dropped it somewhere in the bunker or in the forest. I told him there's no way in hell we were going back. He got angry at me and demanded to know why I hadn't taken any pictures. All I could do was shrug. I got an earful from him as we got in the car and drove back. He kept his word, though, and I enjoyed the pizza from Jet's. Turns out I worked up an appetite after almost getting attacked by the dogman. A week later, Steve told me the Reddit thread had been deleted. He thought our encounter had something to do with it, like maybe the military was still watching the place. I thought it was for the better. No one should be snooping around there anyway. I've never really gotten into stories about strange happenings, but a few years back when I was out in the Humboldt County area, something happened that made me a believer. I'm sure you and a lot of your listeners are aware that this is a pretty remote area of California. It's also beautiful, and a ton of people go missing there every year. I live in Nevada, but my cousin, who I've always been close with, lives in California. In 2012, I was heading to college, so we decided to do a bit of a road trip through Northern California before I had to live in a dorm. My cousin, I'm going to call him Todd for privacy reasons, is no stranger to the northern part of the state. He's a bit of a daredevil and is always trying crazy, risky sports and hobbies. I told him I wanted to keep this trip tame, which he was up for. At the time, my cousin was driving a really old Toyota. It actually had a hole worn through the floor on the passenger side, and I had to keep my feet a certain way so I didn't accidentally put my foot through it. This was in late summer and the weather was great. Further north it cools down a bit, so we had the windows down and my cousin had this epic playlist on. The first few nights, we stayed in motels and bumped around towns like Eureka. We met up with 2 of Todd's friends around there, and they joined us for the drive. At some point, the group of us started telling stories about odd things that had happened to us here and there. I didn't have much to contribute. Like I said, I had a pretty tame life growing up. No weird experiences. But one of the girls who was with us, Catherine, seemed really into this stuff. She'd had a few different encounters, as she called them. At first me, Todd and the other friend kind of laughed and made fun of Catherine a bit. But after about an hour of chatting on this topic, it was obvious she was getting upset about us not believing her. The moon in the car had also changed, maybe just because it was coming on nighttime. This was a stretch where it was really woodsy, and Todd spotted a pretty deep pull off to the right, so we decided to camp out there. I go camping a few times a year and love it, but that night I was definitely on edge. I thought it was just Catherine's creepy stories. They'd gotten weirder and weirder as she told them. I tried to shrug it off. My cousin and I shared one tent, and the 2 friends had actually brought hammocks, so they started up a fire to heat up some food while we set up the tent. That night was pretty quiet and uneventful. This is where it gets a little weird. Even writing in, I feel really self-conscious about this part, but I think finally telling someone about it will help me get over it. Late the next morning, the other girl, I can't remember her name, mentioned that there was a waterfall nearby down a little dirt road. It was a popular hiking area, and decided to stop. There were a few other cars parked there, so nothing felt out of the ordinary. I switched out my sneakers for boots, everyone grabbed their bags and water, and we started into the woods. It was a beautiful day, but surprisingly dark under the trees. At first, the hike was flat, but soon it started going uphill. Made sense since we were heading for waterfall. There were a few tight switchbacks, and some of these opened out onto a view. We could see mountains not too far from us and pockets where the woods dipped down. The fog was rising up out of those dips, which is one of my favorite parts of being in the mountains. About half an hour into the hike, we stepped out onto a switchback that was pretty bare. All four of us slowed down to take in the view. There was another, slightly taller and rugged-looking mountain directly across from us. It had some bald spots, rocky faces sticking out through the trees, and it was on one of those rock faces that we saw the figure. At first, Todd thought it was a bear and quietly pointed it out. But soon it was obvious from the way it was moving that this wasn't a bear. It was definitely a person. The girls backed off the trail a bit, and I could tell they were both uncomfortable. I joined them quickly because the figure across the way from us turned, and it was definitely a person, a guy wearing a dark cloak. I don't know how else to explain it. Almost like a robe. I couldn't get a good look at his face. It was immediately a weird thing to see in the middle of the woods, and the fact that he looked like he was just waiting for something really freaked me out. Todd was standing near the edge of the switchback, basically holding his breath. I had this horrible feeling that something bad was going to happen if the guy turned and saw us. Luckily, right then, a family with a few young kids came trudging down the trail toward us. Todd had to get out of the way, and it kind of reset the vibe. It was hard to smile and act normal. I almost wanted to point the guy out to them, but glanced back that way, and he was gone. We gave it a few minutes after the family passed, and then we all agreed to head back down to the car. None of us wanted to be out in the woods with whatever that was. We made it back in record time, piled in, and flew down the road. No way were we camping in those woods that night. Eventually, Catherine reluctantly started telling another story about something called the Dark Watchers. A few months later, I gave in and looked them up, and I think she might have been right. Definitely seems like what we saw. They're basically beings in the woods who watch travelers, which I guess we were that day. I think my gut had picked up on something, because according to the legends, they're relatively harmless until you make eye contact with them. I'm not sure what happens then, but people disappear. That's not unusual for Humboldt County, but it makes me wonder how many of those missing people have encountered Dark Watchers. This is the first time I'm bringing it up to anyone. Only Todd and the girls know what we experienced that day. I guess I could have used it as a freshman icebreaker, but I would have immediately been the weird kid. As freaky as it was, it's good to know that that stuff is out there. I'm a lot more careful now and aware. This happened about 15 years ago now. I was right around 9 or 10 years old. I was camping with my family in eastern Kentucky. We would go camping together a couple of times each summer when the weather permitted. One of the campgrounds we would go to was on the backside of the mountains. I never liked that particular campground very much. Since we were on the eastern side of the mountains, sunset would come on early, and then all of a sudden it was pitch black out. As a kid, this meant less time to run around the woods with my siblings. My parents were always very strict about having us back at the tent by dark. I can't remember the name of the park offhand. I do remember that all the campsites were hike-in only, meaning we had to park the car at one of the lots inside the park and carry all our camping gear a few miles down the trail to the campgrounds. There were vault toilets at the campgrounds, but no showers or running water and definitely no electricity, so we had to carry in everything. The hike to the site felt unnecessarily long and grueling to me, but I was only a kid at the time. I'm sure it wasn't more than a couple of miles from the parking lot. We got there on a Friday night after my parents both got home from work, and we planned to stay until Sunday afternoon. Nothing nefarious happened the first night, but I distinctly remember having a strange feeling around the campground. There was a change in the atmosphere from the last time we were there. You know how you can feel a storm coming on before it hits? It was like that, but it wasn't a storm. It was like I could just feel that there was something evil out there in the hills. The days were seemingly normal. Nothing odd happened, but then the sun went down. I'm certain it was out there on Friday when we got to the campground, but it moved in Saturday after nightfall. We were all sitting around the fire eating dinner when a sound came ringing out of the woods. It was metallic in nature. It sounded like someone was banging against a pan or something, and then it transitioned into a metallic scraping sound. My dad took a walk around the campground. There were only 3 other people there, and they all heard the sound too. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the campground. It was coming from the forest. My parents told us to stay close to the campsite for the rest of the night. They thought there was another person out there in the woods, and you really never know with people like that. There have been stories about campers being attacked by crazy people before. I know it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. However, this situation wouldn't be so easily explained. We heard the metallic sound a couple more times before we eventually went to bed. I could tell my parents were on edge, and they made us promise to stay inside our tent until morning. I should mention here that whenever we went camping, my parents would have their own tent, and my sisters and I would sleep in a separate tent. Our tent was actually bigger than theirs, so we never complained. Plus, we liked the extra freedom we thought we had, even though our tents were only about 8 feet apart. My youngest sister woke me up at around 3 in the morning, saying there was someone outside our tent. I told her it was probably one of our parents checking on us, but she said no. She said it was crawling on the ground. The wall of the tent was a little bit see-through, but not enough that you could get a good idea of what was happening outside. The moon that night was full, but it still wasn't enough light to be able to see through the tent wall. Still, I knew my sister wasn't lying. I asked if it was a person, and she said yes, but there was something wrong with it. I remember she used the word, it. She didn't say them, she said it. I stayed up with her for maybe 30 minutes before she fell back asleep. I realized that I really needed to go to the bathroom. It would be morning in a couple of hours, but I didn't think I could hold it. I probably should have woken up my other sister and made her come with me, but the toilet was only about 40 feet from our tent, so I grabbed the flashlight and headed out into the darkness. It would only take a minute. I looked around for signs of the person my sister thought she saw, but I didn't see any. I made it to the toilet without any incident, but on my way back, I felt that same feeling as I did on Friday night, like there was a storm coming. And then I heard a click. It was coming from the forest not too far from where I was standing. It was an unnatural sound that made me pause for a moment. Looking back, that is exactly what it wanted. The sounds it makes. It wants to confuse you. It wants you to stop and try figure it out. It wants you to stay there. I knew I needed to get back to the tent ASAP. I didn't want to turn and run in case that made whatever was out there want to chase me, so I calmly turned around and began to walk away. It was then that I heard my name being called from the forest. It almost sounded like my mother's voice, but there was something off about it. And here's the weird part. It was my full name. No one in my family ever calls me that, even if I get in trouble. I always go by my nickname. Always. I turned back around to face the forest, and I saw 2 glowing eyes staring back at me. I couldn't see what they belonged to, but I knew it was something evil. I don't know how it knew my name, but I knew it was trying to keep me there. This time, I ran. It didn't take me long to reach the tent, and it didn't appear that the creature attempted to follow me. I didn't get out of the tent until well past morning. I ended up telling my parents what happened on the car ride home. I thought they would be mad at me for leaving the tent after dark, but they were quiet. I don't know if they knew something more about what was out there than I did, but I was afraid to ask. They never took us back to that campground again. I wish I had answers for the things that had happened to us on our farm, but I don't. No one does. Some things just stay a mystery. And maybe that's the scariest part, the not knowing. We had been living on the farm for generations. It was a family farm. But for whatever reason, unless my parents and grandparents didn't talk about it, the activity started up when I was already in my 30s. When you're raised on a farm, you have your own alarm clock built into your body, it seems. We'd get up as early as 4, but no later than 6. We'd be so tired from work the previous day that we'd fall asleep before nightfall. I really liked farm life. My siblings didn't, so I inherited our old farmhouse. In a way, I never really left it because I was the youngest of us all. So before I knew it, my parents had passed on and I was able to keep it, the house and the land and the animals. At the time, I wasn't married or anything. So I had a few of my friends come and stay on the farm with me. They grew up in our small area and I'd gone to school with them. They weren't married either. So what better things did we have to do? We didn't have any restrictions or obligations to anyone. We could just live a peaceful life, and we did for a while. We had all sorts of animals. We had a couple of horses, Valentina and Katie. We had some chickens, some goats, and pigs, and we had plenty of cows. Of course, we had been used to predators getting to our livestock every now and then. Once, we had to hunt down a bear who kept coming to the farm to take our pigs. Our pig pen was down and out towards the foothills. It was easy for the bear. But we did have to put the bear down, and we found the pig still in its stomach. But with this all said, I think I know when my animals are being picked off by something like a bear and not by something that we can't identify to this day. The first time it happened, there had been a mess in the chicken coop. It wasn't terribly late, so a few of us were still settling down from the day. We heard some squawking and commotion, so we thought it was the bear. We hadn't found him yet. When we ran out to the coop, whatever it was had gone, but left a mess of feathers and chicken corpses all over the place. The first and strangest thing about the events that we had noticed was that the bodies had been left. If this was an animal predator, they would have taken the entire body of the chicken to eat. But they didn't. They killed chickens but left their remains. It didn't make sense. And when we got closer, things made less sense. The chicken corpses didn't appear to have any wounds or claw marks. Well, not at first. When we couldn't figure out what had happened to the chickens, we thought that they could have possibly died from some sort of disease. That wouldn't have explained the commotion or the loose feathers everywhere, but it seemed more reasonable than a bear talking the chickens out of the coop, killing them by an unknown means, and leaving their bodies. So I called my animal doctor friend who helps me when my animals are sick. They said that they'd be down the following afternoon. When they came to inspect the chickens, they were in shock, too. They said that all the blood had been drained and that there were 2 small puncture wounds that were hidden under the feathers. The chickens weren't sick, but something strange had happened to them. The doctor couldn't help us figure it out, though. So, for a few nights, we took turns keeping an eye on the chicken coop. Nothing happened during this time, so we figured whatever had caused the death of the several chickens must have moved on. We got back to our daily lives. Several months had passed. We were starting to get back into the warmer weather when one of our cows collapsed at midday. We weren't sure if it was dehydration, an illness, or something else. And at the time, I hadn't even thought about the incident with the chickens. But my doctor friend came out again and realized that the cow had a very low blood count. And that's when more puncture wounds were found, this time on the cow. Eventually, it moved on to the other animals. We couldn't seem to stop it, and some of our animals eventually started losing square sections of their skin. I'm not sure if this was done by the same culprit, but it was really taking a toll on all of us at the farm. At this point, we knew something was picking off our livestock, but we didn't know what or how to prevent it. We'd stay up late watching for any sign of what might be doing it. We once thought we spotted something, but it turned out it was nothing more than a mangy coyote looking for rabbits. Whatever it was, it seemed like it was very intelligent. It was as if it knew when we were watching because we never did see the culprit. Many more of our animals did die, but eventually the killing stopped. Like I said, my parents and grandparents never experienced anything like this. And if they did, they certainly didn't talk about it. I'm not sure if the creature is an animal, a person, or something else. I'm not sure if it hunts areas in cycles or if it gets tired of certain areas and leaves. Who knows? Maybe the one terrorizing our farm died. But whatever it was, it hasn't returned.